Hello, and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
Richard and I have just got back from giving a joint talk up in Edinburgh, truly one of the world's great cities. And whilst we were there, I was reading about this enormous fire that broke out recently in Glasgow. Basically, what happened is about 3:45 on Sunday, a fire broke out in a vape shop. Seemingly, vape shops are quite liable to fire because they hold so many lithium-ion batteries to keep these vapes going. And what that has done is it's destroyed a major part of Victorian Glasgow, an area that's commonly known as Union Corner, as it's just off Union Street, and is right next to Glasgow Central Station. The building that's been destroyed dates back to 1851, and Glasgow Central Station, one of the biggest stations in the UK, certainly outside of London, has about 25 million passengers a year, remains closed days later, and will be closed for a little bit of time yet. I know that doesn't so far seem especially political, but there are some historical and political aspects of it which I think are really worth discussing. One of them really is just to pour a bit of praise on Glasgow. Its Victorian architecture is outstanding. John Betjeman, a great devotee of Victorian architecture, once said it was the greatest Victorian city in the world, and even said that the Victorian Society, which seeks still to protect Victorian assets and heritage, ought not be based in London, but should in fact be based up in Glasgow. Not a bad idea, I would think. But one thing that seems to have happened in recent years is that so much of Glasgow's historic architecture has just been plagued by fire. The ones that stick in my mind most are the Mackintosh buildings, designed by Charles René Mackintosh, which suffered two fires, one in 2014, one in 2018, and really just was such a devastating loss of a city's architecture and heritage, and also a key living physical embodiment of a period of time in the history of Glasgow itself, but also of architecture and design as well. The question I really want to ask in this podcast, though, is about what do we do in response to them? Because this is not an uncommon thing now. Certainly Glasgow seems to have been particularly badly affected, but major fires, basically wiping out buildings of historical significance, it is happening far too often. There are probably three things that I think we can reasonably do. One of them is to be much more judicious about who and what we allow to occupy these historic buildings or buildings that are adjacent to them. So the fact that this has been started by a vape shop, I mean, there is something of the decline of civilization perhaps being embodied without overdoing it or sounding too nostalgic or too anti-vaping for those who are vapors themselves, or maybe even vaping as they listen to this podcast. There is something there about how many of these grand old buildings now have their ground floor taken over by basically blueberry flavored vapes or whatever. And if these are particularly vulnerable to fire and causing fires, then that is something we seriously ought to think about whether or not we allow those sorts of companies to operate in them. We happen to live in a town that was largely destroyed in the Civil War because it was such a royalist holdout, but was rebuilt from the mid-late 17th century onwards. And one of its older buildings on the high street has just become a vape shop, something that, having read about this now, I treat with even more caution than I previously did. A second thing to say about our possible options is that we know that many of these historic buildings are susceptible to fire, partly because of the way in which they were built. Sometimes they have chasms that allow fire just to travel very quickly and very rapidly. And we ought to think about whether or not it is worth investing in making them to some degree a little more fireproof. The risk with something like that, it's not dissimilar to the conversation we had a few weeks ago about the restoration of the Palace of Westminster, is what seems like it's a practical and pragmatic step somehow gets blown up into this mammoth project that somehow costs far more money than it ever should have done. But we should be thinking really about our historic buildings, the iconic and the very famous like Palace of Westminster, but also Victorian buildings in cities like Glasgow and how we can protect them. And then thirdly, there's the question of what do we do when these tragedies strike? And the thing that I would really hope that we do, we'll see what happens in the case of Glasgow city centre, is make the commitment to basically rebuild in a similar style. In some ways, people would accuse me there of simply trying to recreate the past and say instead it should move on and we should use modern building techniques and modern design and just mark a new chapter in the history of the city rather than try and relive an old one. But I think something like Five is such a gutting experience for a place and the people who live in a place to go through. Such a devastating tragedy when it does happen, then actually we should make every effort to try and restore these buildings and not let some of the best buildings in Glasgow be forever destroyed by a blueberry vape.
Yes, I think I agree with you, Lee, about where possible trying to rebuild in the style of the building that was tragically lost. I have, over the last few years, taken a few trips to Eastern Europe, where many towns and cities were destroyed in the Second World War, and those that were destroyed in the Second World War often got a bit of a second kicking under communism. And what's remarkable is how many of these cities that I've been to made a decision to rebuild their historic city centres in the style that they were before the Second World War. I'm thinking of places like Warsaw and Riga in Latvia. All of these have lost over the decades, lost their some magnificent buildings and then rebuilt them. In some cases, it's a bit like a film set in that the frontage is restored, but the what's behind it is not like it was beforehand. But I think even doing that is preferable to wiping these structures off the face of the physical record of the cities and towns that one goes in. And you might say, oh, well, of course, you would think that as a tourist going to these cities and you're looking for historical buildings and they've put up historical buildings to please tourists. But I think there's something much bigger at play there, which is about tying in the present with the past and giving people a sense, local people a sense of their long heritage. And quite often, I mean, I think in particular, where I felt most moved about this was when I went to Warsaw and I went to the museum about the Warsaw Uprising in the Second World War, which I found a very moving experience, partly because I happened to know someone who was involved in that, who only died a couple of years ago. It wasn't really until I'd gone to that museum where I had realized that basically all of Warsaw was left as rubble. There was basically nothing left. And then the decision to rebuild its historic center from ashes, from nothing, to its former glory, I think speaks to something of the resilience of the place. Obviously, what we've seen here is not something that's been destroyed by war, but destroyed by a tragic accident or negligence or whatever it turns out to be with this vape shop. But I think it will be important for Glasgow to say how much its heritage means to it today, to take the steps to restore the historic buildings, perhaps not exactly like they were. Some of their interiors might look different, but I think it would be better to try to come as close to one as one can within reason to the historic, at least frontage of those buildings, than to just say, oh, this is an opportunity to wipe it away and let's build, quite frankly, in my view, probably something that will be much inferior, plasticky, glass looking, harsh stonework, um, whatever the fashion of the relevant architect might be at that particular time.
I'm conscious that there will be people listening to this who think that we are, at best, overly romantic about the past, and at worst, outright reactionaries in our architectural taste. And I think it's worth exploring that a little bit. Certainly explicit in what we say. And I think this is the reason why I think historic buildings, preserving them, and maybe even recreating them to the extent that we can is important, is that there is something valuable about a place and a people being anchored to its own history. And one of the best ways of doing that is literally by the physical space that you occupy. It's particularly important, I think, when we think back, because today you could build, if I think of a village not too far from here, a few years back, they built some new houses in a Scandinavian style. They're perfectly interesting things to see. But that's not something that would have happened 200-300 years ago, in part because that knowledge may not have traveled in quite the same way. And if you go much further back, when there are limitations around technology as well as knowledge exchange, then you will find that more local materials are used, local trade practices. There'll be local names associated with architecture who may not have travelled around the country in the way that, or the world, in the way that architects today would. So I think trying to maintain and restore some of those things is actually of quite great value. Implicit, I think, in what we're saying, in fact, you said it rather more explicitly at the end then, is that if the space that has been created by the destruction of buildings by fire were to be used for a new project that isn't anchored into the past and that space, then it could very easily end up looking worse or uglier than it would. If we were to think about the cities that were severely damaged in the Second World War, I used examples like Warsaw. There are cities that weren't rebuilt as they were, but were built in the mid 20th century style. But they are not necessarily attractive in the way that a city like Warsaw may be. On the question about history and how do we restore history, there's an example actually that came to mind as we were talking about this, and this is Clarendon Park in Surrey. So this is an 18th century Palladian mansion, or was, at least in some respects, because in 2015 it suffered from a catastrophic fire that rather gutted the building. I should say it's a National Trust property. The language that the National Trust uses about it is not to say that the building was destroyed, but to say that the building was transformed. And they see the current, really ruined state is almost part of its journey as a building. And so their plan, in spite of the fact that they've received a really rather large insurance payout around this, is not to try and restore or recreate an 18th century style Palladian mansion in Surrey, but instead to almost freeze frame and stabilize the burnt ruin as a tourist attraction in and of itself. That is something which I personally think is really objectionable, partly because whilst rebuilding it would never be as good as the original, and it would always lack the authenticity, the wear and tear that you only get from actually having been a building that has lived for 200 plus years and been lived in. I think that would certainly be better, particularly for a charity that ought to focus much more on heritage, preserving heritage, and making it accessible to the public. Big part of what the National Trust is there to do. I think rather than saying, well, we're going to create heritage around a fire, effectively, my view is that they ought to be trying to restore what they can of heritage as it was before the fire. And this is something which we will see actually how this plays out, because the National Trust has put their proposals forward. They got approved by the relevant local council in Guildford. But a couple of organisations have sought to challenge that, one called Restore Trust, which is a general campaigning group which seeks to influence the way in which the National Trust works to focus more on its core founding objectives, and the other being the Georgian group, which, rather like the Victorian Society I mentioned in reference to what John Betjeman thought of Glasgow, seeks to preserve and to champion Georgian architecture in the UK. They were involved in putting together an appeal for judicial review, and that process will play out in the weeks and months ahead. So we'll see exactly what happens there and what the future of Clarendon Park will be. I think it'll be a very important test case for how we come to think about these issues in the years to come. Richard, what's your matter of interest this week?
Well, Lee, you and I read the same subject at Cambridge. Our degree was called Social and Political Sciences, SPS. And basically, in our second and third year, we focused on studying politics and history, actually. And in many ways, it was a great degree and education that we had at Cambridge. But one of the deficiencies, or one of the absences in that degree, is that there is no economics teaching, or at least there wasn't when we did it. And as someone who teaches politics and about policy, inevitably one touches on questions about economics in the process of doing that. And I've always felt a little bit of a deficiency in myself for never actually having formally been taught about economics. I've been effectively a complete autodidact on economics. And so recently an opportunity came up to take a one-day foundation economics course in Westminster put on by Civic Future, which is a fantastic organization set up by Manira Mertzer and Pamela Dow, which is all about trying to improve the knowledge base, in a sense, of people who work in and around British politics. And it was a great day. I really enjoyed it. It was a serious and rigorous day, but also convivial and enjoyable. Lots of interesting people there, good lecturers that were brought in. And we covered the sort of basic terms, ideas, and assumptions about the economy. We talked about deficits and debt. We talked about growth. We talked about public spending. We talked about taxation. We talked about demographic pressures such as an aging population, illness, health, birth rates, immigration, etc. It was very, very good course. That being said, there is still something that I feel is a bit missing for me, just speaking for myself here really, in terms of my desire to understand economics. And I think part of that is driven by my longer standing study of the British Constitution and the history of the Labour Party. Because as I have in my academic work gone back and looked at the history of the Labour Party, particularly one of my pet subjects, the history of labour in Europe, one sees in that a set of economic policy debates that we just don't really have anymore in contemporary British politics, and a way of talking about economic choices before governments that seem quite alien to politics today. And part of me felt that that was because of our long-standing position within the EU, which took away many of the tools of economic policy making from our government and handed them in whole or in part to European institutions. But I don't actually think that's quite the full story, because it's not, as it's turned out, been the case that after leaving the EU, we've sort of actually properly revisited many of these economic debates. And moreover, I just sometimes feel that when I hear people who are trained in economics talk about economics, they talk about sets of assumptions that are made out as if they can't be questioned, because anyone who's sensible or knows anything about economics would, of course, agree with this set of assumptions. And so it's sort of not even raised as something that can be debated. And let me give you an example. So as part of this course, as I mentioned, there was a lot of discussion about deficits and debt and the pressures of an aging population and how immigration might or might not alleviate that. And it was mentioned that British debt to GDP ratio is now very high, much higher than it's been in the last half a century. So British debt to GDP ratio at the moment is about 96%. And we had a discussion, a sensible discussion, about how a government might bring down the debt to GDP ratio. But there was part of me thinking about, is it such a high debt to GDP ratio? Is it such a bad thing to have a high debt to GDP ratio? And in the back of my mind, I was thinking about Japan. Japan's debt to GDP ratio is 230%, and it actually hasn't been below 100% in like 40 years. So what we see as our highest sort of unsustainably high debt to GDP ratio, Japan has not seen that level in like 2 generations. When one raises this, people will say, well, but look, the Japanese economy is so sluggish. It hardly grows. I looked it up last year. The Japanese economy grew by 0.1%. We don't want to be Japan. But then I think, well, are we sure we don't want to be Japan? Japan has the highest longevity rates in the world. The average lifespan for a Japanese woman, the average is now 88. They are some of the healthiest people in the world. They have excellent public services, excellent infrastructure. It's a clean country. It's a safe country. It's a high trust society. And as I say all those things, to me, those are surely the social outcomes that we want. Okay, maybe Japanese people aren't getting richer, but if you're getting richer, but you're living in a society that is also getting unhealthier or unhappier or more insecure, then surely actually the trade-off you would rather make would be to live in a society that, okay, maybe GDP isn't growing, but actually you have a really nice quality of life. Now, I'm sure, and I know, that there may be factors about Japan that are distinctive to Japan. People say, when I've raised this in other discussions, people say, well, Japan's debt is different from Britain's debt because Japan lends to itself and its own population. Okay, well, why can't we do that? And people say, well, because the City of London and this, that, and the other, importance of the City of London and our open financial model. Okay, but do we have to have that financial model? Maybe that isn't a good financial model, or at least maybe it's one we should question or challenge. I suppose what I'm saying is that I sometimes find that I hit brick walls with discussions about people who know a lot about economics. They sort of look at me like I'm a bit stupid for even asking these questions. And maybe I am, but I'm not sure that I am. And I think what I would like to do, and I know Civic Future offers more advanced economic courses and things like that, and I'm interested in seeing what those are like, is really to unpack and challenge some of these assumptions that feel like they are just kind of truisms of modern British political economy.
It's an interesting subject, and what you've expressed about economists isn't too dissimilar from what I sometimes say about lawyers in politics. Economics and law are both highly subjective areas, which often get treated almost like a science. They're arts that get treated as science, basically. And that's partly because they have their own distinct terminology. And in the case of economics, of course, they have numbers, which gives it a sense of empiricism and authority, which disciplines like politics don't necessarily have. But partly what that has meant, and I've used this example in the past, I think, when talking about lawyers in politics and in parliament, they almost get treated like they're on a pedestal. And if they make a political argument but frame it in legal terms, then it's seen as almost being above just somebody else's political argument. And I think the same is true for people with expertise or knowledge of economics. Also get to make political arguments. The arguments that you've discussed about, the orthodoxies that you've raised, are fundamentally political statements and assertions, but they almost get treated as if they are a scientific reality rather than just an assumption on which they have chosen to base what they think and what they say. I don't think that is healthy to have a situation where people can almost say, oh, it just doesn't work like that, or oh, you just can't do that. I see these orthodoxies ought to be challenged in part for their own sake, because that challenge will strengthen them, will strengthen the arguments people make in favor of them, or actually may find that some of the orthodoxies we've been living with for quite some time aren't necessarily correct. After all, most people think that the last 20 years or so for Britain and its economy have not been particularly successful. And yet it sometimes feels like we're clinging on to the same economic assumptions that we have done throughout that time. without really wishing to be too radical in our thinking. Now, lots of the radical thinking I wouldn't necessarily agree with, but it doesn't mean that the debate's not necessarily worth having. And I actually think this desire to push at the boundaries of conventional thinking about issues like economics is actually one of the things that appeals to people about somebody like Zach Polanski as a political leader. Not somebody I'm drawn to. I actually don't think he's as good a politician or political leader as he is a fairly gimmicky communicator, and I think he will in turn get somewhat exposed and found out, and the shine will fade. But nevertheless, there is something of an appeal there because I think that is what he is doing. A point I wanted to make is that ultimately, when it comes to governing the nation, politics is what trumps everything else. We are, after all, a parliamentary democracy. Our members of parliament and alongside the House of Lords and the Crown in Parliament can do and legislate as they wish in this country. The things that they may wish to do may have economic consequences, but that is just something for them to factor in and consider. It's not something to necessarily rule out action. So I'm reluctant to maybe step into this territory, but I always want to try and defend some of the economic ideas that Liz Truss came out with, not because I agree with them necessarily. I actually think much of what she proposed was deeply daft and not very well thought through, but because I do think she had the right to propose them. This idea that Liz Truss tried to push the envelope of economic thinking in this country and therefore, quote unquote, crash the economy and therefore showed actually something you must never do. And we must simply put the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, on an ever greater pedestal to avoid being like Liz Truss, I think is a nonsense. Liz Truss didn't really, if we're honest with ourselves, crash the economy. What she did is she crashed Parliament. And she came up with a set of measures for the economy which did not command sufficient support in the House of Commons. And that was ultimately why Liz Truss fails. It's because of her political failure rather than her economic failure. If she had managed to convince the vast majority of Conservative MPs to go along with her economic package, then she would have been able to pass it. Might that have had adverse economic consequences? It very well may have done. Were some of those things arguably the wrong thing to do in economic or political terms? Something like reducing the top rate of income tax, as was proposed in that mini budget. I think that's probably true. But these are legitimate things that politicians can debate and can do. And we shouldn't hem ourselves in to a relatively narrow set of economic orthodoxies and say that anything beyond that is simply not possible in political life. We should say, well, actually, our sovereign parliament can do what it wishes, but what it chooses to do sits within the context of reality, and that there will be economic considerations that they must factor into that. But nevertheless, it can do what it wishes to do.
I agree. I think that there's been too much of a separation of economics from politics. And perhaps I feel this way particularly acutely as someone who spends his time uh, studying and teaching politics, and now coming to economics, maybe at a bit of a later stage in my life. But of course, there are economic consequences to political decisions. But even if they are, on the face of it, adverse economic consequences, we may still opt for those adverse economic consequences because there are some other set of considerations that we think outweigh those adverse economic considerations. One example that comes to mind is about nationalizing water. I can remember last year I was at a wedding and I was talking to someone who was an advisor to the current Labour government. And I was, quite honestly, I was complaining about how badly things were going. And maybe he was a little unhappy to hear me complaining about it. Maybe it was a bit unfair for me to complain to someone who was so in the thick of it. And he said to me, "All right, if you're so clever, what would you suggest that we do then?" And I said, "Well, first thing you can do is you can nationalize water." And he just said, "Too expensive." And I said, "Well, not necessarily, because under the British Constitution, if Parliament passes legislation to nationalise water, it can name its price." And one objection someone could say to that is, well, then they can take you to court under the European Court of Human Rights. And indeed, this did happen to the Callaghan Labour government. The Callaghan government nationalised shipbuilding and aircraft building in 1977, I think it was. And the companies that were nationalized took the government to court in Strasbourg as a violation of the right to private property under the ECHR. Now, as it happened, the Labour government won that case, and so it didn't have a showdown with the ECHR ultimately, where the ECHR said that that action was incompatible with the convention. However, my view is if the European Court of Human Rights had said that this action was incompatible with the ECHR, I think then the Labour government or any British government ought to say, we're doing it anyway, and if you've got a problem with it, then you can kick us out, to be honest, because I don't see the benefit of being part of a convention that basically makes socialist economic policies unlawful. But going back to the water, when I have said this to people, then they will come back and say, well, but there would be all these negative consequences if you bought out, say, Thames Water at below market rate. I don't doubt that there might be. I know that many pension funds have invested in Thames Water, including my own pension fund, the USS pension fund, which is the academics pension fund in Britain. But that being said, even if maybe in my own self-interest, that's not a brilliant idea, that shouldn't necessarily rule out the possibility of looking at doing this. And even if there is a hit to some of these pension funds, that maybe that's a hit worth taking. Obviously, pension funds make investments. When they make investments, they take on a certain degree of risk in making those investments. Some investments go up, some go down. I don't see why the British government should be prevented from taking a basic utility back into democratic control because some pension funds have made a stupid investment or a wise investment or just an unlucky investment. And I'm sure there are people listening to this who are saying that these are not good ideas and disagreeing with ideas, and that's fine. But what I think frustrates me is that we don't even get to these debates because people who have a degree of economic expertise often, I think, act as gatekeepers, perhaps not consciously, but act as gatekeepers to even getting into these discussions about a wider set of economic policy opportunities that should be on the table, are on the table with our constitution. Everything is on the table. And that's one of the great things that I love about the British Constitution is it should open up these debates and we can chart our own futures in quite different ways. We don't have to subscribe to a particular orthodoxy.
I think that discussion that you had at the wedding about nationalising water basically shows what are often the perils of thinking too narrowly or being too wedded to existing orthodoxies in politics and economics. So, for example, he may think that's too expensive or not something you can just do. But in fact, what is the alternative? Well, the alternative is that with Thames Water at the moment, if you take the water provider where we are, and a particularly dreadful provider of water, well, the current situation is that people who live in the area that Thames Water provides get fleeced, charged enormous bills for their water supply. There are leaks all over the network that don't get invested in. There is untreated human excrement being pumped into our rivers and waterways. And just the fact that that's how it is now, and that there might be some political costs to nationalising that, and at least having some sense potentially of accountability around it for members of the public. Realistically, I have zero accountability over Thames Water. I've got no choice but to pay it. I've got nobody else I can go to. It is not something that you could even justify on free market grounds, really, the idea of privatisation there, because there is no competition. So we have an awful company that fleeces members of the public, does not do a very good job, and the economic orthodoxy as it exists in the mind of that advisor and people in government is that we can't touch it. And why do they think that we can't touch it? Well, because there are economic and political costs that may be associated with the way in which they choose to do so. For example, like you say, that there are funds, pension funds and others that are invested in part in Thames Water. Would there be an adverse consequence if the government nationalised them without compensation, for example? Sure, there would. But should it be seen as being this untouchable asset class just because some people who run investment funds happen to have bought it? Because otherwise, why would that not necessarily apply to anything else? A final thing I just want to say on this is that part of thinking more creatively about economics, and I don't say this as an economist, and there'll be qualified economists who might be screaming at their podcast app of choice, or maybe they've turned off by now in disgust at some of the things that we've said. But quite often, what it has done, I think, our economic thinking in recent years is come up with a set of metrics or almost shibboleths that everybody feels they have to say and acknowledge. So GDP growth, as a general idea, would be one of them. And I do see some sense at the moment that we're beginning to see some challenge against that, including with people saying, well, actually, why are we talking about GDP? Why aren't we talking more about GDP per capita? That would be GDP per individual person. Now, there's an argument for talking about both at the same time, obviously. GDP is not an irrelevant statistic. It's connected to things like the strength of the national economy relative to others and whether companies may wish to invest in the UK, etc. But then there is also a sense in which if you make that the core criteria and the thing that you're striving to maximize at all times, then you can in fact end up doing really absurd things. We see this in every Treasury calculation and forecast, where the Treasury basically wants as much immigration as possible, because simply having lots more people in the country will boost the gross GDP of the country. But it could diminish the GDP per capita or wealth per person as a country. And actually, maybe part of what we ought to be thinking about is actually about how prosperous we are as individuals within the nation rather than just as a nation itself. I'm not saying I have fixed views on that, but sometimes the things that we've just chosen to focus on and prioritize very narrowly aren't actually the whole story. And by treating them as such an important aspect of political and economic statecraft, we've actually done ourselves more harm than good.
Just on the GDP point, this past weekend I was up in Manchester, where you used to live, Lee, and the bit of Manchester where you used to live, Deansgate, is completely transformed from what it looked like when you first moved to Manchester over a decade ago. And that transformation has been the construction of a very large number of luxury blocks of flats. The construction of these flats and their existence, of course, has added quite considerably to the economic activity in Manchester, and then is, of course, recorded in GDP, its growth. But many of the reports about these blocks of flats is that they are owned as investments, they are left empty, or they're owned by landlords, many of whom don't actually even live in Britain, but is part of an international property portfolio of investments, that the people who live in them are probably paying quite a lot to live in them. And that's all adding to economic activity in the country in one respect, and growth and GDP growth is duly recorded. But I'm not sure if that's actually that great for our economy or our society. I mean, going back to my point about Japan, it's like, ultimately, what are we living for? Are we just living for a country just to get richer? Are we living just to get richer? Or are we trying to think about the way in which people live, the communities that people live in, the society that people live in? And, I just think there's like this fascination with these particular growth measures that our politicians and civil servants have. And part of it, of course, is because our media is also obsessed with them, and opposition politicians are obsessed with them, and they use them as cudgels to hit the governing party with. I just feel sometimes that we're talking past the things that really matter.
Two very final points on that theme. One of them is that if we do just treat economic activity in and of itself as being a goal, you're right, we fail to capture lots of the things that we consider more or less desirable. So if we bring it full circle around to talking about old buildings, well, knocking down an old building and building up a new one probably generates more economic activity than preserving the heritage of the old building. I'm not necessarily sure that that's a better thing to do. I actually think preserving our heritage has an intangible value that you can't capture on a spreadsheet, but that is actually good for society and the country and our sense of self and knowledge of our own history. And just on that point you made about the enormous boom in flat building in Manchester, which has changed the skyline unrecognizably from when I lived there. Both renting and owning for people are economic activities, in the sense that if you're paying rent or you're paying a mortgage, there is economic activity that's generated there as part of that. If you were to just map that onto a spreadsheet to say about economic activity associated with that flat or that unit, both of those may look similar. But at the level of the experience of the person who lives in that property, being a homeowner compared to being a renter, particularly if you're just paying money to what may be a international investment fund that has bought these properties as a buy-to-let investment and does not necessarily even pay much tax in this country. The experience of the person or the citizen is wholly different compared to if they're just writing a check or making a bank transfer every month to that company, compared to if they're acquiring their own equity in something that they will own themselves. And some of the facile ways in which we've tended to think about economic activity don't necessarily capture the enormous variance of the experience and the well-being of people. Well, if you're not one of the economically trained people who've switched off so far, thank you for sticking with us. If you've enjoyed listening to the podcast, we'd of course be thrilled if you left us a positive review wherever you get your podcast from. If you've got views or thoughts, please do feel free to get in touch. Our emails are in the show notes. And if you're a member of our Patreon, there's a link to that in the show notes too. There's a members chat where you can share some of your thoughts, maybe even your frustrations with some of the things that we've discussed in this episode, or maybe some other themes that you think we've occasionally overlooked. We'll be back on Sunday with our next deep dive into a topic in post-war political history. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.